Hi, I'm Leah Louise from Inspired Quilting by Leah Louise. Thank you so much for being here today. I'm excited to share some free patterns with you today. I have 3 baby quilts that I want to share the patterns with. They're downloadable printables, but what's great is that these are very easy, simple quilts to put together. That doesn't mean they're not beautiful. They are absolutely gorgeous with wonderful colors. And I'm going to show you a quick review of how to make each quilt. Plus, there'll be a downloadable link below for the printable pattern as well as the website if you want to read more information. So let's start with the first quilt that is a 4-patch. And this is a quilt you've seen before. The companion quilt, the woven one behind me, is a match with these particular fabrics, but this is a great quilt to make, and all the charm squares are put together into a 4-patch, and then the quilt is assembled from there. So by doing that first, that makes it a much easier quilt and more manageable to chain stitch when you're dealing with a larger 4-patch than all the smaller 5-inch squares. So this is a great one to give a try. And then I have a 9-patch for you to take a look at. These go together really quickly because you're putting so many blocks together at once. And again, these are all charm squares, and what we're going to do is create a 9-patch. And that's going to also create a fast and quick quilt, but it also gives you some opportunity to have some fun with color and design, and this is a wonderful quilt to try, and I'm anxious for you to see this pattern. But here is the absolute easiest quilt. And this is one that you've seen recently, and I've had a lot of response on this quilt because see how none of these seams line up. Everything is offset just a little bit. And I have a free pattern for you to download. I'm going to show you how this works in this video, and I'm also going to link to the other videos for each of these quilts. So if you want to see the step-by-step method, you can do that. There's a lot of information in here, and I'm so excited that you're here and I can share it with you. Thanks so much for being here. I hope you enjoy these quilts. I hope you have a great time making them. Oh, and don't forget, please subscribe to my channel. Now watch these quilts. Here's the first quilt I want to share with you. This is called a 4-patch, and that has to do with the way we assemble the blocks. There's a total of 80 5-inch squares in this quilt. They go 8 across by 10 rows. And what we do is we pre-piece these charm squares into a 4-patch. That means 4 blocks are sewn together with a common corner in the center. What I did in particular on this quilt is I laid out my colors into multiple piles so that I could coordinate each block with dark, light, and medium fabrics. And what I did here was try and keep the strongest contrasts at opposite corners. So I first sewed this pair here, these two, then I sewed this pair, and I put them together, making sure that the strongest colors were diagonal from each other. And the reason that works for a quilt like this is the colors then become more spaced evenly, and we're not going to get a cluster of a lot of darks in one place and a lot of lights, unless you're focusing on a specific color, and that's what you want to do. But when I have a lot of individual blocks, I will often put them together in a 4-patch in a manner like this, and I'll create 4 piles, and I make sure that the fabrics don't repeat themselves in any of the blocks. So all this lavender print is in that pile. All the dot print is in this pile. And so as I'm drawing, I know that I'm not going to get 2 of the same in the same block. And it works out really well. Now, the next step when you're chain piecing these blocks together, just like you would any other, you would lay the first one down with the second one on top, sew down this seam, and then continue to the second one. Put that block on top, sew down this seam, and you do it all the way through. What's nice when you have these pre-pieced into a 4-patch is there's fewer larger blocks to sew together, and you're less apt to either miss a row, or sometimes the problem I have is I'll get a row that'll twist itself, and I'll grab the block, but it turned and I'm sewing, and then I have to go back and fix that. When you work with a larger block like this, I find it's a lot easier to manage, and it's definitely far easier to see what you're doing and catch any mistakes before you get too far. And that's one of my favorite methods. Now, when you do a quilt like this, when you have dominant colors placed consistently in all your blocks, you can also use that to your advantage to make a design. One of the common designs that we do is when we have our dark blocks and we put them all in a diagonal. For example, if you see how these dark blocks go. Now, I didn't do it down here because I wanted an all-over color. I didn't want a strong diagonal pattern, but you can certainly do that. If it's a particularly light fabric or dark, it's going to stand out and create a really nice pattern. But I just want to show you the colors across the quilt and see how well they all blend together. There's no place where we see any particular fabric or colors that just settle in one spot. Everything covers the entire quilt, and it just looks really pretty with all these colors mixed together. And I love how it worked. I enjoy so much how it came together. There is a larger version of this that I'm going to show you. It'll actually, it's hanging behind me, and you'll get to see that. But I want to also show you the backing. So I chose one of the fabrics and just made a solid backing for this quilt and chose a nice blue for the binding. And I think that really works well with these fabrics. It looks wonderful. I'm really excited about it. So this is a very easy quilt. If you're a beginner, this is a great place to start. If you're an experienced quilter, this is a quick place to start because it goes together really fast and it's simple to assemble, and you're going to have it done in no time. So if you need a quick quilt for a gift, this is one to think about. Here's another easy Charm Square quilt that I want to share with you. And again, these are all 5-inch squares sewn together in blocks. Now this one is sewn into what's called a 9-patch. So we have 3 by 3 for a total of 9 squares within each block. So this is our finished block. Now this quilt is made with 81 blocks. It's 9 across and 9 down. So when you use a 9-patch square, you have to use increments of 3 because each side of your block has 3. So if I use 3 blocks, then I'm going to have 9 of my squares down each side. So that's just something to keep in mind when you use a 9-patch. And it's great because it's a large size block. You can see right here, we've got 5, 10, so it's at 13.5, so it's going to finish at 13 inches, which is great. It makes it very easy to sew. And when you get to your final assembly, once you make all your 9 patches, you only have 3 blocks in each direction. So that goes together very quickly. Now let's talk a little bit about how this block is laid out. And in this one, there were a lot of different fabrics. These are all really bright, bold batiks. They're in ocean colors. I liked the sort of lime chartreuse colors in there because it draws out some of these other blocks, but it also adds some great contrast. And that's what I love to see in a quilt, because the contrast is what makes it really pop and grab somebody's attention. Now, the other thing is you also need a place for eyes to rest, so that as I'm looking across, if everything were all these bold, busy fabrics, it's hard to really get a whole picture. So I put some low volume in, and low volume simply means that they're on the lighter tone, they're less saturated. See the difference on these sort of diamond dots versus these gray dots? You can hardly even tell there's anything there. There is design, but it's subdued. It's sort of in the background, and it lets your eyes rest, and it also allows these other colors to stand out more strongly. So in this particular 9 patch, each one was laid out with one of the darker colors, the bolder colors in this corner, surrounded by 3 of the low volume, and then I put 5 of the bold colors again. And I wanted to include a contrast in this corner as well as someplace outside here in the block. So as I'm putting these blocks together, I'm going to get some contrast spread out throughout the quilt. And this works out really well. So the advantage for me is that this is a large block. It goes together quickly. It gives me some versatility in how I want to assemble my quilt, how I want the colors, the design to be laid out, and I like that. Now, this isn't the only way to lay out a 9 patch. Another common thing to do would be to take these 3 and put them diagonally. And then as you're making your quilt, if you line these blocks up all the same way, you're going to have a diagonal across the entire quilt. And that's a lot of fun. So that can create a pattern that you really enjoy. And depending on how you place your colors and what colors you use, it can be very, very attractive. As I'm preparing to make the 9 patches, again, I pile my fabrics into their specific categories. So I'll have a group that I'm just going to have for the center. And you can see this is where the center is here with the 3 lights around it. And I want that center to really be bold and stand out within those light fabrics, which are the low volume. And then I have the other bolder colors that are going to go around the edge. And you can lay those out however works for you. I just like mixing them up. I just make sure that the same block is not repeated anywhere within this 9 patch. And that's essentially all that we have here. It's very quick and easy. It's not complicated. The other advantage to doing a 9 patch is it's easier to match your seams on a smaller square than in the big quilt. So once these are all assembled, you go to put them together in the larger scale to finish your quilt top. This is already done. You don't have to worry about it. Now what I do when I piece my 9 patches is I'll sew 3 together like this, and I will have them laid out just the way I want them so I know what I have. Sew those and I press them, and then I sew these 2 long seams together. And these are the points that I match up. And I want to nest those seams. And in order to do that, I need to press these in opposing directions. So if we look at this block in particular, these were sewn and pressed this way. Whoops, I'm going the wrong direction. These were pressed this way, this was pressed that way, and this was pressed this way. So when I put my seams together to nest them, the seam allowance goes in opposite directions, which allows me to nest those seams really nice. And that's how you're going to get your best corners to match up, is when you have your seam allowance on the opposite side and you nest them up. And you can feel it between your thumb and finger. You can feel if there's a space in there, which means your seams are not lined up properly. So it's a great quilt to go ahead and make, and it goes quickly. It's a lot of design opportunity. And again, this pattern is right down below. You can go to the website to read more about it specifically, or to download the pattern directly. Here's a fun Charm Square quilt that is just sewn together randomly. There's 80 squares, so it's a 2 charm pack quilt, and it's 8 blocks wide and 10 blocks long. And they're just put together. I just made sure no 2 colors were side by side and just sewed them, put just a easy backing and binding, and it looks wonderful. The difficulty for this quilt for a beginner are these corners. If you're not accustomed to working with a 1/4 inch seam allowance and nesting seams, a pattern like this can be a challenge. Even though it's a straightforward 5-inch square repeated throughout, because you have these areas that you need to line up in order to get these squares basically perfect, so they look nice and they're not all, wonky and turned every which way. It takes time to learn how to do that, and it takes practice. But that doesn't mean you still can't make this same beautiful quilt, and I'm going to show you another option. This, and I thought this was cute with a pretty little yellow gingham on the back. This one is very easy, because if you'll notice, see how all these squares are offset. I sew this row together, I sew this row together, but notice these seams don't line up. And the reason is we use an offset square or rectangle, an offset block at the beginning. All we do is take half a block. Actually, this starts out as a 3 by 5, and that gives us a little wiggle room that we can trim off if need be. But that makes sure that we have enough to keep our quilt nice and square. But see how this row, we have a narrow. This is the full square, a narrow and a full square. And this alternates throughout the entire length of the quilt. And this makes every row offset, and it goes together quickly. The only real quilting technique that you need to follow is the 1/4 inch seam. And even if your seam isn't exactly a 1/4 inch, as long as each seam is the same, it's going to fit perfectly. I want you to be able to see the entire row here, so you can get a visual of how this goes together. So we have our block of 5-inch squares, our row of 5-inch squares, 8 blocks across. Now this row is the offset. We have an offset here and an offset here. That means we have 7 full-size blocks and 2 halves, which make our 8th block. But one thing I need you to understand is if you take a 5-inch square, cut it in half, and put it on either end, you're going to come up short because that's an extra seam allowance. It won't be significant, and if you're okay cutting these other rows down by roughly 1/2 inch, that'll work fine. But what I did is I used a 3 by 5. So I took my charm and I cut it 3 inches, set the 2 inch aside for another project. Now that means that this quilt is going to be 8 by 9 if you use charm squares. Now I started with fat quarters, so I was able to cut these out of the scrap fat quarter pieces I had left over. So this is still an 8 by 10. So that's just a decision you can make along the way. But the advantage to this quilt is how easy it is to put together, primarily because there's no matching seams. And that's probably one of the biggest challenges facing beginning quilters, is learning how to get those seams to match. The previous 2 quilts that I showed you are great for beginners. It's an easy put together. We put our blocks into larger units and then sew the whole quilt top together. This might be the first place to start. If you've not made a quilt before, this is going to be your easiest bet, because you just sew straight rows, then press everything in the same direction. Everything goes the same way. That way, when you put these 2 seams together, all the seams are going in one direction, and you're going to sew in that direction. So you don't have to worry about seam allowances flipping up, twisting, going the wrong direction, because everything goes the same way. It's so easy on so many different levels. And even for an experienced quilter, this is a great opportunity to make a fast quilt. But what I love about it is, look at this nice pattern. I love the offset pattern. Now, this is very pretty too. Oh, there we go. I like this look, but I just think that this offset adds a little more of a design element. and it doesn't look quite so structured and rigid. I tend to like things that flow more smoothly, and that's why I like this. I think it came out great. I know that you can make this. This is a perfect quilt to start with. And again, the pattern is downloadable. They're free patterns. The link to the website so you can see all the read all the directions there. Plus, you can download a printable pattern for reference. So take advantage of these free patterns. There's some wonderful opportunities to make some quilts here, and I think you're really going to enjoy them. Here's the first quilt we talked about, a full view of how it looks, 8 by 10 charm squares. It's a very pretty quilt done in a 4-patch pattern, and is quite simple to make and is a good way to learn how to nest your seams and work on your seam allowances. This is a great practice quilt and would be easy for anyone to make. Here's another batik Charm Square quilt that incorporates low volume fabrics as well as the batiks and some pretty strong contrast throughout. It's a 9-patch, which goes together quickly. It's nice because you can create the larger blocks before you assemble your final quilt, and that makes it particularly easy to get all those corners done ahead of time and then match the rest of them as a second step. This is 9 by 9 charms for a total of 81, and it makes a sweet sized baby quilt. And again, this is a great one to practice on, but you do still have nesting seams, seam allowances in order to get really good squares. And this may not be the best first quilt, but that's the one that's coming up next. And here's the easiest of all. By offsetting those seams on every other row, this quilt goes together very easily. Everything is pressed to one direction. There's no matching seams. There's no corners to worry about. It is an absolute breeze to make. And the only concern you need to worry about is your seam allowance. So if you're a beginner and you're just practicing seam allowances, this is going to be an incredibly forgiving quilt for you. All 3 of these patterns are available as a free download. There are links below as well as the web page for each of these quilts where you can get more information. I hope you enjoyed these quilts and the review of some different ideas of how to begin quilting and work on some expertise and challenge yourself a little bit as you move along. And you experienced quilters, don't give these patterns up as too easy and you want to pass on, because these are some fabulous quilts that you can get done very quickly when you need a quick quilt finish for someone as a gift. You've got some great options here to choose from. So I hope you all have a great time quilting. Make some wonderful quilts and be sure to show me what they look like. Have a great day now.